Good morning to everyone attending our webinar today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Communicating in a Crisis. This is the sixth series of strategic webinars we are holding with young Arab leaders who have been a strategic collaborator since 2018 and for which we are extremely grateful for their support. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Pearl Initiative, the Pearl Initiative is the leading and only independent non-profit organisation founded to promote the business case for the implementation of the highest standards in corporate governance, transparency and accountability across the Gulf region's private sector. Launched in 2010 in cooperation with the United Nations Office for Partnerships, the Pearl Initiative aims to convene businesses, decision makers and future young leaders to take the lead in promoting and adopting greater standards of corporate governance. Pearl Initiative also engages with a wider business ecosystem in the Gulf region, collaborating with over 40 companies as well as 30 regional universities to collectively drive our mission forward. We work as a think tank and build data by publishing cutting-edge research reports and case studies to inspire business change. Today's webinar is being held as part of our MSME program. As you might be familiar with SMEs, they are considered the backbone of the regional economy. They account for between 80% and 90% of registered companies across the region, but their contribution to regional GDP does remain relatively low. As SMEs compete with each other in a saturated marketplace and strive to be both innovative and fiscally sustainable, we must understand the fact that implementing corporate governance is the key to facilitating their success. Pearl Initiative obviously understands the necessity of good corporate governance for small business success, and in 2017 we launched our Governance and SMEs program to engage small businesses on the importance of corporate governance for positive economic outcomes. Good governance is flexible and can be modified to fit a business's particular needs. It is not meant solely for the realm of large corporations and multinationals, as is commonly perceived. SMEs find that applying governance policies practices will help them build a stronger, more resilient and more profitable business. About today's webinar, we are pleased to have this webinar to discuss how SMEs across the region can strengthen their communication with all their stakeholders during this period of crisis. Throughout the life cycle of a business, it faces a range of challenges that can threaten its reputation and ability to operate. As has recently been demonstrated with COVID-19, however, these challenges can be eased with effective corporate governance and forward planning. The webinar will discuss how corporate governance and strategic communication can help a firm navigate a crisis, reduce business complications, minimise its impact, and develop a reputation on which it can build future business success. As I mentioned, we are collaborating with young Arab leaders for this webinar. I'll quickly give a brief introduction to young Arab leaders for those of you that aren't familiar as well. So Young Arab Leaders is also a not-for-profit organisation founded during the World Economic Forum in 2004 under the patronage of His Highness Sheikh Maktoum, Vice President and Prime Minister of the UAE and ruler of Dubai. YAL seeks to leverage the capabilities and expertise of its strong regional network of members in order to catalyse the entrepreneurial and professional development of the next generation of leaders. Its mission and vision are to empower the next generation of leaders in the Arab world by developing a strong network of industry and business leaders to serve as mentors and role models to the youth and entrepreneurs across the region. It does so by fostering entrepreneurship and innovation and creating a hub for new business and investment opportunities. YAL has a mentors and advisors network, is engaged in community initiatives such as entrepreneurship workshop series, a mentorship program, and weekend competitions, and has a vast support network. Moving on to our speaker today, we are pleased to welcome Zainab Ad-Din, a YAL member and Regional Manager, Middle East Project Associates, UK, as our webinar facilitator today. Zainab Ad-Din is an active member of Young Arab Leaders and the Middle East Regional Manager for Project Associates based in Dubai. She works across the international government, corporate and private client spheres to build and deliver intelligent and innovative communication strategies. Zainab advises an array of clients on crisis and reputational management, devising positioning strategies to develop their profile and best protect their reputation across complex political, media and business landscapes. Zainab, and thank you for your time and insights today. Just before I hand over to Zainab, I'd just like to mention that our webinars are intended to be interactive. There is a forum for you to submit questions and engage with Zainab directly. So please take advantage of those. Send the questions through to Zainab and she can answer those. Perhaps not immediately, maybe she'll answer them immediately, but will be addressed either at some point in the webinar or left to the end. So do take advantage. And thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the webinar, and thank you, Zainab.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thanks for that wonderful introduction to myself and to PA. It's we're quite excited to be able to give them this opportunity to be able to discuss with you guys all about crisis communications. Especially, I think it's so relevant today more than any other time. So briefly, Yasmin gave an introduction to myself, but I'm just going to introduce you to Project Associates, so PA, as I might refer to it throughout. We are a strategic communications firm. We were established over 20 years ago. And we advise corporations, individuals, family offices, and governments on communication issues, mostly crisis and reputation issues. And often these are at the nexus of the political, business, and media worlds. So our key areas of expertise are we do EU, UK political counsel, media relations and political campaigns, litigation support, profile building, digital advocacy, public diplomacy, and one of our biggest strengths is our ability to deliver key opinion leader outreach programs as well. I'll go into a little bit of detail about what that actually is later on. So if we get started, first things first is what's in a reputation and why is it important? So a reputation is best defined as it's a third-party perception of you, your brand, and it's how others see you. You know, as the age-old adage goes, you know, your reputation precedes you. So overall, a company's reputation is a function of its perceptions amongst all of its various stakeholders. So the investors, its customers, its employees, you know, possible regulators, and also the community in which it also operates. And so in particular, there are specific categories. So corporate governance is very, very important in shaping a firm's reputation. Employee relations are also important. Customer service, financial performance, its handling of environmental and social issues. All of these are matters that help shape a firm's reputation over years. But a reputation is also very malleable. You know, in the words of Benjamin Franklin, you know, it takes many good deeds to build reputation, but sadly, it really takes only one to lose it. And it can be lost either by you or it can be lost by a third party and the actions of a third party. So in today's digital environment, you know, reputation is more important, it's more pervasive and meaningful than ever. So as we've said, it's notoriously difficult to build, to enhance, to sustain, and to protect a relationship, but it's so simple and effortless to bring one to its knees, sadly. In the past few years, we've seen multiple occasions where a disaster that can happen over the space of a few minutes even can circle the globe within hours and can bring down a centuries-old reputation in days, if not handled properly. Wells Fargo being one of the big examples here. So by changing how you portray your organization and how you prepare your organization, then that will change the way that people can perceive your reputation. So a few examples here that are more relevant or people will be familiar with, for example, is Amazon. So its failure in the COVID-19 pandemic, its failure to kind of put worker health first, and for its leadership to prioritize profit, you know, refusing to close down the warehouses where workers have been infected with the virus, not providing the adequate PPE to staff, and the working conditions to staff there, I think, have massively affected its reputation. And even though, you know, everybody being at home, Amazon sales are going through the roof, that's kind of more of a necessity than a choice at the moment, and time will tell whether or not Amazon's success continues after a sense of normality returns to people's shopping abilities. But also, such was the damage that Bezos himself kind of pledged that they're going to spend, I think, 3 billion or 4 billion to try and to help with the outbreak, because he's seen that, you know, people have just been like, you know, in an instance like this where the whole world is trying to come together, he's still prioritizing money. Uber, in 2018, they were the darling of ride shares. They were one of the first, but claims of sexual harassment, minority discrimination, unethical and hostile work practices have just seen lawsuit after lawsuit, and ever since, the company has remained in damage control, to the point, and especially in a region here where, you know, you have others, you have Kareem, and in the UK, in the US, sorry, you have Lyft and other apps that are kind of taking over from Uber as well, because people have just been like, this is not acceptable. And finally, Facebook. So it's the platform that launched social media. It has almost 3 billion users, but after the Cambridge Analytica data leak and the fallout from the fake news scandal and around the US election in 2016, you know, there was the delete Facebook hashtag campaign, and that also led to the largest stock market value drop in history. I think it was around $120 billion, and Zuckerberg himself lost about 17 billion of his own net worth from all of this. So one thing for us to get to is to be able to determine whatever is happening, is it a crisis or is it an issue? These are two very different things, and this is where companies often fail to put together the right action plans, because they both require very different responses. So a crisis is often an unanticipated event, and it disrupts the day-to-day operations of an organization. It creates reputational harm, as we've seen. It can cause severe financial difficulty for the firm. If the incident includes an injury, illness, or death in any way, then it's most definitely a crisis. It requires an immediate response, and will require input from the organization's leadership, from the very top down. And the response will involve multiple stakeholders, including staff, authorities, regulators, customers, business partners and affiliates, and the media. Whereas an issue, just going back 1 second, examples of crises can present themselves in several ways. So you can have an organizational crisis, so where a business has wronged customers, or for example, there has been a manufacturing fault along the manufacturing process, and there is a faulty stock. You can have technological failures, so system failure, hacking attacks. There can be a natural disaster, of course, an earthquake that could cause a building to collapse. There are personnel issues that can become a crisis very, very quickly. So you'll have a violent attack on an office in the start by a former member of staff, or a drug-taking CEO and it's leaked, and all sorts of salacious details there. And then also there are financial crises. And I think the biggest examples at the moment that we can all kind of understand what's going on is everything that's happening with NMC, and also what previously happened with Abraj. So moving back on to issues, an issue is often an identified event or a trend which could have a significant impact on an organization if it's left unchecked and develops into a crisis. So no doubt issues are very serious, but when they're not properly handled, they can turn deathly serious and metastasize into a full-bore crisis. Examples of an issue can literally be a lawsuit that's brought against the firm all of a sudden. A labor dispute. So you might have, a manufacturing firm that its staff will turn around and say, okay, we're going on strike until this is resolved. These things are issues that, if not handled at the time, will very quickly become a crisis. But the key difference with an issue is that the management will have an adequate time to assess the situation. All of the facts can be determined. Costs will always remain a consideration in the response, and commercial operations can usually continue as normal. Whereas in a crisis, usually the firm is unable to continue any operation at that time until the crisis is resolved. And where with an issue the costs remain a consideration, in a crisis, for example, if there has been a natural disaster and a building has collapsed and you need to hire big diggers to be able to remove rubble and pull victims out, you're not going to say, oh no, that's too expensive. You'll do it, and then you'll deal with the financial repercussions afterwards. So I will pause here for now if anybody has any questions for this section. Otherwise, I will just continue. So we'll go on to the importance of corporate governance and crisis management. So good corporate governance and crisis management, they go hand in hand. And failure to take into account and to prepare for a crisis puts a board on the back step, on the back foot, and it can help bring down the organization, even those that were once thought too big to fail. So for example, Lehman Brothers back in 2008. So the board of a firm must prepare for any eventuality. And in this instance, failure to prepare is preparing to fail. I know people use this a lot, but in this instance, it's very, very true. So next. And in the same way that boards kind of look at economic forecasts, reputational risk should stand alone as a forecast in and of itself, as well as being party to all other risks. And so planning for a crisis should become second nature. So planning for the unknown unknowns requires a good process and a strong leadership, rather than just having a single playbook approach with pre-agreed decisions, which in some ways is helpful to have as a starting point, but the ability to be malleable and the ability to kind of maneuver around each individual element of a crisis is what is going to stand out and help you recover. The enduring role of a board is to oversee, to assure, and to support and crisis management teams, and it's a critical component of risk mitigation. The board needs to understand what components are in place and be satisfied with them and test them out frequently. They must be ready to play their part and step up should a crisis arise. Now, before a crisis happens, the board needs to scrutinize its management plan. Is everything, are all their systems working fine? Have they prepared for, everything that could possibly happen? Not just everything that they think might happen to a firm like theirs. So a manufacturing firm might think, okay, we'll have a fault in one of our machines, or there will be a product that is defaulted, or there may be an accident with someone on site. These things are to be expected for a firm like that, but they also need to think beyond that. Think beyond the box, as everybody always says. Think of things that you would not imagine would ever possibly happen to you, but have happened to somebody else. You still need to prepare. Once a crisis hits, the board needs to have a supportive internal role. They're not public facing. There will be a designated spokesperson, and that is the person who faces the public. That's the person who deals with the media. But the board needs to kind of basically hunker down and just work to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. But should the need arise, they should be prepared to step in. And then after a crisis, obviously a crisis will always have an end. But the fallout from a crisis can continue for a very, very long time, especially if there are legal issues at hand and, ultimately there will be court cases potentially. So the role of a board after this is to assist the firm in returning to a new normal. What are the practices that they're going to be adopting, to investigate the cause of the crisis, and to identify opportunities for change. Where did they go wrong? What caused this to happen? And what can they change to make sure that they build resilience to avoid it from happening in the future? So the next important part is why it's important to communicate during a crisis. A lot of times people feel when something happens, the less we say, the less people will hassle us, the quicker we can just get on with resolving this issue. Now, a crisis though, it's a living and evolving thing itself. While no two are the same, communication is the one mainstay of any crisis that happens. Now, who you communicate to might not be the same. So you might only need to communicate, depending on the level and severity of a crisis, you may only need to communicate to those who are within the firm. You may need to communicate to an international audience. But the reasons that you do need to communicate is because you need to own the story before the media gets hold of it. Because once they get hold of it, and we'll come to this next, they will run away with the story. And you can very, very quickly lose control. Depending on what has happened, you need to communicate to prevent shock turning into anger, which, as we've seen, especially in the age of Twitter, this can happen very, very quickly. You need people to maintain trust. So they need to still be able to trust your firm. This is where the reputation is important, because the reputation that people hold of your firm that has been built up over the years of your operations, they still need to feel that this has just been a blip, that you are still capable and you are willing to resolve this. You also need to preserve the short-term appeal to demonstrate that the show must go on, that this is not the end, and to also protect the reputation long-term. The one thing that people always make a mistake with, though, is that using the media, they think that the media is their audience. That, oh, well, if we speak to the media, if I can convince the media to print this or to not say this, then they will turn, their opinion will change, and we'll have them on side. No, the media is not your target audience. The media is a channel for your communications to your audiences. Now, it's important that when you do communicate, and we'll come to later on as to who it is that actually speaks to the media, how well this spokesperson or executive comes across in the early stages of a crisis is critical to taking control and establishing a favorable public perception moving forward. So in this instance, there are what we call the 5 C's of crisis communication. The first one is competence. And early on in a crisis, before the facts are known, when everybody is just as blindsided by everybody else in the news, it's easy for an executive or a spokesperson to appear flustered, to be unsure. And the problem here is that the public cannot see how well you are handling the crisis internally. They're not able to see the executive delegating roles in their private meetings or hearing the phone calls where the executive is fully in charge and overseeing everything that's happening. So fairly or not, the public will judge your competence based on how well you perform during that few seconds, couple of minutes that you have in the media spotlight. And so if you're able to handle a press conference with challenging questions with dexterity, then you're competent. And if you look uneasy, if your eyes are looking around the room, if you're blinking too much even, then you're not. Credibility. This is the one question that drives the public's perception of an executive or a spokesperson more than any other. Does this person get it? Anything that undercuts their credibility threatens the public image for the rest of the crisis, and potentially forever, depending on who this person is and how big of a mistake they make. So in some cases, the best way to gain credibility is to concede rather than defend an obvious point. So where necessary, hold up your hands if it makes sense, and mea culpa, accept that the mistake was made and move on. The commitment. In order to set the right tone, executives and a spokesperson, they need to express a deep commitment to in communicating with affected stakeholders, with the media, with the general public, with regulators. And in doing so, this ensures that the reporters will use you as the primary source for their questions and for the information they're looking for. This helps you and the firm able to control the narrative and control what is being said. Caring. Now, little makes the public turn on an executive in a crisis more than somebody who is cavalier towards any victims. So an example of this would be Tony Hayward. He was the CEO of BP during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And he, in one interview, he was asked, when do you want this? How quick do you want to see this resolved? And he said, nobody wants this resolved faster than me. I want my life back, making absolutely no reference to the fact that 11 people lost their lives. He made the issue all about him, regardless of the fact that this was one of the largest environmental disasters in history. It was all about him. And the public very quickly turned on him, and from that moment on, it was almost impossible for him and for BP to kind of claw their way back out of that crisis. It just got worse and worse. So for executives, capability also is vitally important. The public must perceive that this person is capable of solving the problem. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to answer every question that's thrown at you at any given time. One of the best ways, and this is a lot of the times we work on this in media training with clients, is to sometimes, it's fine not to have an answer to a question. It's fine to say, okay, I don't have the answer right now. Can I have your details? Let me go away and get you the information you need, and I will get back to you. That's perfectly fine. And that also helps with capability, because people will still think, okay, actually, this person knows what they're doing. This crisis is safe in their hands. Now, coming back to when we said that the media is not your audience, there is like a hierarchy of people who should be your audience, depending on what has happened. The first being people who are impacted by the crisis. Secondly, you then move on to the environment. So in the case of BP, what they should have done was to acknowledge the 11 people who lost their lives. Then they acknowledge the issue of the impact on the environment. Then they need to start focusing on their messaging, can be focused on what's going to happen to BP shares or its capability to produce oil, etc. And finally, it starts looking at money. But to put money first, to put the assets of the business interests first, and ignore the human aspect of a crisis and the social aspect of a crisis, that's the death knell right there. So we're coming back to what we said the media will do in a crisis. Their focus, they have one focus only, is to get the story out as quickly as possible and to keep it alive for as long as possible. And to do this, they'll create their own narrative. And this is why it's important to have a team ready to respond to questions, because you want to control the narrative before it runs away from you. The media will want to exploit whatever human angle there may be to the story. They will try to find a scapegoat. They will dig. All of a sudden, the media will have access to the company's files 10, 15, 20 years beforehand to find any internal divisions that there may be. They will also target supporters of the embattled organization. So anyone who's coming out to support you are going to become a target of the media themselves. And they will ride the wave of citizen journalism that is the bane of many people's existence today. And this is one of the most problematic, because this will increase the pressure for a firm to act quickly. People will panic and think, okay, no, we need to respond to this now. And that is what can backfire. So how many times have we all read a news story that has just been filled out with tweets that support the arguments the article is trying to make? And additionally, there are actually even some websites, I won't name them here, whose whole purpose, they will draft an entire article full of tweets, and the article is there simply to present the case that the tweets are making. So this is why you need to move. This is where we move into the handling of a crisis, and what the board needs to do, what the firm needs to do, and what you need to do before and during to handle all of this. So reactive communications. This is once the crisis has hit, what do you need to do? What does your team need to do to be able to resolve this as quickly as possible with minimal reputational damage? The first things first is to set up media and social media monitoring. The team has to be ready for backlash. What you're going to read online is most certainly not going to be pretty. You need to be available to respond, but the team needs to have protocols in place to acknowledge, ready to kind of filter through everything that's coming in, whether these are certain tweets from the public, whether these are media requests, and to filter which one of these need a response. Which one is going to have the most impact if we don't respond accordingly? Be prepared to have a 24-hour grip over the whole scenario. There's no such thing as a weekend in a crisis. So you have to be prepared to put in the hours to make sure it's resolved as quickly as possible. And more often than not, in our world, we've noticed, anyone who works in PR will know, the best time for a crisis to happen, because it will always happen, at 5 p.m. on, I say Friday because I'm still used to a UK working week, but it'll be at 5 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon here, just as everyone's packing away, and it's going to be impossible to try and get hold of the people that you need to. And then it will be all over Friday morning, Saturday morning's newspapers. Rebut, rebut, rebut. In order to get ahead of the story and to regain control of the narrative that the media is going to try and run away with. You need to centralize all of your communications. You stick to the designated spokespeople. Now, we'll come to this later on as to what the board needs to do beforehand, and this is the importance of the corporate governance to prepare for these eventualities, but you need to stick to designated spokespeople. Now, be prepared for the fact that there are going to be leaks. There is never a way to avoid a more junior staff member speaking to the press or speaking to a friend who then goes to the press and gives away some information that was only known or was, the firm was trying to keep quiet. So internal communications are also vital, as well as public communication with the media. Everybody in the firm needs to know what to do should an incident like this happen, and what the repercussions will be if, for example, leaks were to happen. So the most important is that in all of your messaging, you have to be clear, concise, compelling, and consistent. But most importantly, be human. Everybody makes mistakes. Firms make mistakes. Nobody is perfect. Now, whilst the public perceptions of some of the, these huge firms that we all know and love around the world, we hold them to very, very high esteem. And we hold them to, we have images of them and perceptions of them that kind of are really, they're unrealistic. But they will still make mistakes, and the way they handle them is what is going to impact our decisions, whether or not we continue to do business with them. So this is where we move on to the proactive communication, and this is where this is what good governance is to prevent a crisis. So we always say to any of our crisis clients, you prepare for the worst and you hope for the best. And a proactive strategy mitigates the risk of losing control and minimizing long-term reputation damage. Think of it basically as an insurance policy. We all have home insurance, car insurance, travel, health insurance, and we pay out every month for all of it in the hope that we'll never need it, but it brings us peace of mind that we've got it just in case. So, first place to start is to create a dedicated crisis team. This team needs to have a cross-functional reputation of the business. So it can't be too big because it needs to make decisions fast, but it can't be too small that it fails to take into consideration the business as a whole. You plan for the full range of likely scenarios. Like we said earlier, this is not just things that we expect to happen. These are things that we hope will never happen, but still have to prepare for should they ever. We then need to anticipate these issues, and we prepare holding statements for them. These statements can then be tailored when necessary, but it helps to have a head start so that you're not rushing to scramble and get sign off on them when you need to issue them, when you've got 15-minute deadlines to get them out. To identify hidden stakeholders. This is where, when I first started, we were talking about the key opinion leaders. These are third-party stakeholders, unrelated to your firm, who are able to push out your messaging, and it just helps kind of build that reputation. It helps, it's one thing for you to say, we are brilliant at, our CSR programs are amazing. We've done this, 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 and that. Okay, well, everybody expects you to say that. Of course you would. You're singing your own praise. What makes it stronger and what people genuinely value is when a third party, when somebody else is saying this about you. This is what makes it stronger. These are the people who will be your firm's champions, And these are the ones that you'll be able to fall back on should the crisis hit. Then you nominate a single spokesperson and a backup for media contact. So putting together this crisis team and you have identified your spokesperson, should this spokesperson suddenly be on maternity leave, on annual leave, on medical leave, should this person be impacted by the crisis itself, who's the backup? You need to be planning for all of this so that should anything happen, you're there, good to go, ready to roll everything out. And then establish media handling protocols. Who's going to field all of these media inquiries? What do they say in response to them? How do they liaise with the media? Who do they pass these inquiries on to? Having all of this in place, having all these protocols put together, ready in advance, means that when they're coming through, the inquiries are getting to who they need to get to as quickly as possible to make sure that there's no delay in the response. Because the worst thing that can happen is that the newspaper will contact you, you don't get the response to them back in time, and they just run X, Y, and Z, failed to respond or chose not to send a response to the question. That's the worst thing, because then it's like, okay, you're hiding something. And then finally, it's to hone the internal sign-off processes. So which subset of the crisis team is going to be involved in this? Are they people who can be reached at any time? Is there a backup should someone not be available? What messages can you already sign off ahead of time so that they are ready to go should anything happen? These are all things that, if put together as an ongoing process all the time, so it's constantly reviewed, it's constantly audited, you're constantly using these hidden stakeholders to push out your messaging, then you're preparing your firm for the worst should it ever happen. So corporate governance and its role in building long-term crisis resilience. As we said earlier, every crisis will end, but recovery starts now. The best way to kind of get around this is to make sure that you have started this recovery process from today. So running crisis simulation exercises, practice makes perfect. War game exercises, doing them in real life and remotely where possible. I mean, we've all seen, this is taking it to another level, obviously, but we've seen where governments run exercises in, terror attacks, and they run exercises with all of the emergency services to make sure that they are all prepared and they all know what to do should a terrorist attack happen. It's the same situation, obviously scaled down and hopefully not as serious. But war game exercises are a great way to do this. So we also have, I don't know why it's not clicking, there you go. So a regular review of the processes. These are your processes. You develop your crisis communications plan. You put together your comms team and all of the processes that happen. You train all these people, you test them out, and then annually or however often you want to, the more frequently the better, you review these and you recommend any changes that will help improve it and make it as bulletproof as possible. And then you audit these plans and the processes, and then you start all over again. It's also helpful to be proactive with the media, even when there is no crisis going on. You want to promote the good news that your firm is doing. Any acquisitions, any big sales or announcements, any large-scale donations that are being made, or any findings that you may have, and it's good to promote these across 3 types of media. So the owned media, on the blogs, on your own social media channels, on your own websites, earned media in press coverage, so targeting, using, employing a strategic communications strategy that allows, that brings your key messages and your stories to the press attention, so that the press will write their own organic stories about what you're doing. And then again, through the third-party endorsers that the key opinion leaders that we've come back to. Also, it's important for, and as we were saying here, when we review and recommend and we audit these plans and processes, learn from the past. What worked well last time there was an issue or a crisis? What didn't? What can we change to make sure that we don't fall into the same traps as we did before? And always mitigate your legal risks and engage with advisors. Make sure that your lawyers are on board with everything that you're doing. Make sure that your lawyers are prepared for a crisis as well, so that they're able to help you as best they can. Because a lot of the times when it comes to a crisis, if it's left to evolve and just get out of hand, a lot of the times your ability to respond just disappears. Once it becomes a legal issue and lawyers get involved, then they will drive what happens, because their priority is to make sure that nothing goes on that's going to be detrimental to the legal case, in which case then your ability to speak to the media kind of disappears. So you need to make sure that they're engaged and on board before anything even happens. And so coming to a kind of a conclusion in a sense, I've got a couple of examples of what the right way is to handle a crisis, and then we'll go on to what the wrong way is. So for example, KFC. Now, you may not know, but in the UK in 2018, Kentucky Fried Chicken ran out of chicken. And basically, people were up in arms, as outraged as you can imagine, that the one ingredient they really needed to have was just not available. And so KFC probably had one of the, and this will probably go down in history as one of the greatest social media comebacks of all time. So they rolled out some brilliant advertisements in all UK newspapers with the KFC letters rearranged on the bucket to own their FCK up. They also maintained a page on their website where customers could check the chicken status of their local restaurants. And they kept on top of the news by answering questions via social media almost daily. So they created a set of infographics like this, and they weren't formal about it. They accepted that it's a chicken shop, it's fast food. People liked the fact that they engaged as if they were humans. They made, even one of them was, they made a joke about it. Some chickens have now crossed the road. The rest are waiting at a Pelican crossing. But what was brilliant here was that they're able to say, we've set up a page, so customers were able to go to their own website and check when will their local KFC open. And this kind of just completely, they did all of this so quickly, so transparently. It made everyone kind of put away their torches, and they celebrated the humility of KFC owning up to the mistake in the first place. If you want to go online and have a look, I suggest looking at some of their tweets and things, because they are hilarious. But on a more serious note, for example, Tylenol. In the 70s, I think it was, 5 people died taking Tylenol pills that were laced with cyanide. Now, this is kind of one of the most serious of all kind of PR disasters in history. And basically what happened is, to this day, by the way, the killer has never been found, but Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical owner of Tylenol, put customer safety first. They quickly pulled more than 30 million bottles of Tylenol off the shelves, which lost them 100 million in revenue. They stopped all production and advertising of the product, and they got involved with the police, with the FBI and the FDA, and offered up $100,000 reward. After the crisis died down, they reintroduced Tylenol with new tamper-resistant packaging, coupons for money off when people go to buy them, and this tamper-resistant packaging has become an industry standard around the world right now. And so this is the thing, and their reaction to this has made them one of the go-to case studies when anyone is studying crisis and communications around the world. It's regarded one of the most successful crisis management reactions in history, and the media and the public appreciated the lengths that Johnson & Johnson went to and its concern for public interest and safety, to the point where the Tylenol brand recovered, and now Tylenol is very famous in the US. We have different brands here, we have different brands in the UK and here in the GCC, but it's a brand that everyone knows of, and now no one really even remembers it. You have to kind of have been following it or be aware of the industry to know that this happened. And finally, we can look at the very, very wrong ways to handle a crisis. We've spoken briefly about them on BP. So one of Tony Hayward's first mistakes in the Deepwater Horizon crisis was that when they did acknowledge the explosion and the oil that was leaking into the sea, his response was to say that the Gulf of Mexico is a very big ocean, and the amount of volume and oil and dispersant that we are putting into it is tiny in relation to the total water volume. This was the first thing he said. This was he completely ignored the fact that the 11 people had lost their lives. And then, I mean, it also ignored the environmental impacts. And this is why we said, you know who your audience is. You have people and then environment. And he completely disregarded the fact that it was possibly the largest oil spill in history. Millions and millions and millions of barrels of oil were leaking into, and it took I think a good 2 months for them to finally seal the leak. And so he then went on to say, there's no one who wants this over more than I do. I'd like my life back. And the board at this time were getting increasingly kind of worried of his handling of the situation, and the feedback that they were getting from the public, from governments. Obviously, this is a huge deal politically, and in the US, and President Obama's government took a very, very strong stance against this. And President Obama even said himself, he was like, you know, Tony Hayward would never get a job in my cabinet with the statements that he's been making. It was a good month later when BP finally acknowledged, they published a statement that finally acknowledged all of the faults, because initially they said it wasn't their fault, and they acknowledged they accepted blame, they acknowledged that they handled the situation poorly, and it did little to help their reputation. But I don't think Tony Hayward was out. The Deepwater Horizon happened in March. Tony Hayward was replaced as chairman of BP in July of that year. So for him, the way he handled this crisis was career ending. Another example of a crisis handled terribly is United Airlines. Now, back in 2018 as well, they forcibly removed a passenger, and it made headline news all over the world, how this passenger was taken off the plane because they had overbooked the plane and he had refused to give up a seat that he had rightfully paid, booked, and was sitting in. The passenger himself was a man in his 60s, doctor in his 60s, who suffered fractured ribs, a broken nose, and a broken tooth in the incident, as well as a couple of cuts to his head. Now, United's initial response, this is their CEO, Oscar Munoz, their initial response was to issue a statement a day later, after the uproar had happened, to say that they were regretful for the passengers who had been, I'm trying to remember what he said. I apologize to reaccommodate these customers. Now, I think everyone looking at the pictures can see that this is not just a reaccommodating a customer. And so again, they were just looking to preserve their image rather than to accept that what had happened was, you know, on a human sense, on a social sense, unacceptable. The situation then got worse because an internal email that Oscar Munoz himself sent to United staff a couple of days later showed that he was siding with the staff and the way that they handled the situation in removing the passenger. So this therefore took away any credibility that he had. This was one of the 5 C's, the credibility he had when speaking to the media, because he was saying one thing and then actually in private was saying and doing something else. And the airline itself was already kind of taking a hit. A couple months prior to this, they had been under fire for asking two female black passengers. They stopped them from boarding because they were wearing leggings, and they said that they didn't fit the dress code that they require passengers to wear. So it was just, for United, this was like another nail in the coffin. And while the firm is still operating, it consistently ranks as the lowest rated airline in the US in customer satisfaction. And people vote with their feet, and so their numbers have been slowly falling. Passengers are choosing to use other airlines. Southwest in the US has an incredible reputation, offers cheap flights like this, and so it's people, when handled incorrectly, people will just be like, okay, fine, this is how you want to handle it, no problem, we'll move elsewhere. And this is where reputations to companies kind of really get hit. And this is where we say the issue itself and the crisis itself can be resolved relatively quickly. Like in this, it was a few minutes of an incident. The crisis after a couple of weeks died down because the regular news cycle took over, but the fallout, the economic impact and the fallout for United continues to this day. So that's kind of everything. If there is any questions that I would be happy to answer now or later on, do let me know. Otherwise, Shruti?
Hi Zainab, we do have a question from the audience.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, Ms. Tracy Austin asks, how do you adapt the crisis response processes for smaller organizations, especially when there are fewer dedicated resources or a smaller team available within the organization to deal with such a crisis?
How would you adapt? Was that, sorry?
Yes, that's right. How would you adapt the processes for crisis response for smaller organizations?
Yeah, so the process itself stays the same, regardless of however small or large the organization is. If the crisis response team for an MSME is 2 people, then it's 2 people. But the process stays the same. Their roles need to be designated beforehand. They need to practice together, how they will respond, how they will filter, how they're going to receive inquiries, who out of them is going to be speaking to the media and the relevant stakeholders. It doesn't matter how big your crisis team is. It's who is in the team and the roles that are designated to them for the size of your firm. So if it includes just, if an MSME has just kind of a chairman or a CEO or a founder, and then just a couple of other people who work for them, that's fine. The crisis response team can be the entire workforce of the firm. If the firm is small enough, then it can incorporate all of those people. But the same principles need to apply.
Thank you so much.
Anything else?
Even the business is very small, but I think something more strategic and not that cash. I know.
If that's everything, then I'm happy to kind of wrap up today. But you guys have my email address. If ever you have any other questions that you want to discuss later on, I'd be happy to answer them after this.
Thank you so much for your time, Ms. Dean. It's been a pleasure having you, and it's been such an insightful webinar, truly.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone else for joining us today. We've got other webinars coming up, so please stay tuned and have a lovely day.
How do I?